Louis XIV was not only the most powerful king of his time, he was also the most scandalous. His reign was remembered for military victories, political brilliance, and unimaginable luxury, but beneath all that glitter lived another truth, his disturbing obsession with seduction. Every noble at court knew it, every servant whispered it, and every woman close to him understood that entering his world meant stepping into a dangerous game of desire and survival. His life as a ruler was one thing, but his private life shaped the destiny of France as much as his laws or wars. From the earliest years of his reign, Louis XIV treated women not as companions but as weapons of influence. The first to experience this was Louise de La Vallière, a gentle young woman who never intended to become the king's mistress. She was shy, modest, and deeply religious, but her innocence was exactly what drew him in. For a while, she softened his image, and many at court believed she truly loved him. Yet even Louise became a pawn, pushed into his arms by ambitious families who saw her position as a stepping stone. The Queen Maria Theresa knew her role in this story without protest. She was the lawful wife, silent and dutiful, but the real queens of France were the women who shared Louis's bed. Everyone saw it, and no one doubted it. The court functioned on this reality. Seduction was power, and the king's desire was a crown that could be passed from one mistress to another. When Louise faded from favor, Madame de Montespan arrived, and with her the entire kingdom shifted. She was bold, witty, and fearless. Unlike Louise, Montespan never pretended to be modest. She wanted power, and she understood that the king's passion was the only path to it. She gave him children, argued with him openly, and manipulated the court through her hold on him. Ministers feared her, nobles courted her favor, and enemies watched for the smallest chance to ruin her. But Montespan was different for another reason. She was willing to go further than anyone else to keep the king's passion alive. Soon whispers began that powders, potions, and charms were entering the palace through hidden hands. Servants carried stories of rituals done in her name. Rivals accused her of consorting with fortune, tellers and poisoners, all for the sake of keeping Louis bound to her. This was the beginning of the most shocking scandal of his reign, the affair of the poisons. What started as rumors about jealous wives trying to win back straying husbands quickly grew into something much darker. Dozens of nobles, priests, and commoners were accused of buying poison, hiring witches, or attending blasphemous ceremonies. At the center of the storm was Montespan herself, accused of taking part in black masses and using aphrodisiacs on the king. The truth was never fully proven, because Louis XIV needed it buried. The king could not allow the world to know that his desires were controlled by powders and rituals. He ordered the investigation to be silenced, trials ended, and records destroyed. But the damage was already done. People believed it, and the whispers turned into legends that have followed him for centuries. What makes Louis XIV's story disturbing is not only the excess of his passion, but the way it dictated the fate of an entire country. Nobles pushed daughters into his arms like offerings, rivals poisoned one another to gain favor, and politics bent under the weight of his desires. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a marketplace of seduction. Women were traded, reputations destroyed, alliances broken, all because the king could not separate power from lust. Even in his later years, when guilt and religion began to shape his choices, his past haunted him. He turned to Madame de Montespan, a pious woman who tried to reform him, but the image of the king of seduction never disappeared. His reign proved that absolute power and absolute desire can corrupt a man in equal measure, and when both live in the same heart, the consequences can shake an empire. This is where our story begins, not with the glory of the Sun King, but with the dangerous secret life that defined him. Louis XIV was not just a king, he was a man whose desires were powerful enough to poison a kingdom. Louis XIV became king at the age of just 5 years old. His father, Louis XIII, died when he was still a child, leaving the boy to inherit the crown of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. At first, he was too young to rule on his own. His mother, Anne of Austria, and the cunning Cardinal Mazarin served as his regents. During those early years, the boy, king, witnessed what power really meant: endless conspiracies, betrayals and revolts, the Fronde Rebellion, a violent uprising of nobles and commoners against royal authority, left a permanent scar on his mind. He was nearly kidnapped, humiliated, and forced to run for safety while still a child. From that moment, he swore he would never allow anyone to humiliate him again. The trauma of his youth made Louis obsessed with two things: control and image. He learned that authority was fragile and had to be reinforced daily. He also realized that power was not just about armies and taxes, but about spectacle. If people could be made to admire him, fear him, and worship him, they would never dare to rise against him. This was the seed of the Sun King, the man who later declared, "I am the state." As he entered his teenage years, Louis discovered another weapon that would define his reign: his body. He was tall, athletic, graceful, and skilled in dance, a talent that carried enormous weight in 17th century France. He often performed in elaborate ballets, dressed as gods or heroes, his every movement designed to impress the court. Women adored him, men envied him, and from a young age, he learned that charm could command obedience as surely as swords. By the time he reached his 20s, Louis had begun to shape himself into the perfect image of absolute monarchy. He trained relentlessly in etiquette, expecting others to bow, flatter, and serve him without hesitation. Every gesture was deliberate: to kiss his hand, to hand him a glove, to speak in his presence. These small rituals became demonstrations of loyalty. He was building a world where everything revolved around him, and his charisma was as critical as his crown. It was in these formative years that Louis developed an appetite that went beyond politics. He learned quickly that desire could be a form of power. Young noblewomen who captured his attention gained sudden prominence, and ambitious families began to push their daughters toward him. The court was no longer just a political arena. It was a stage of seduction. The king's attraction could alter fates overnight, and everyone knew it. Yet Louis was not reckless in his youth. His approach was calculated. Unlike many monarchs who wasted themselves in early excess, he built his reputation step by step. He was careful to keep his early encounters quiet, ensuring they served his image rather than tarnished it. At the same time, he cultivated a public image of discipline: long hours of work with his ministers, strict military training, and endless rehearsals of court ceremonies. This duality, duty on the surface, desire beneath, was already forming. The young king's education in seduction was not limited to women. He studied the psychology of everyone around him. He understood envy, ambition, and fear. He knew how to raise one courtier while destroying another, not through violence but through attention and neglect. His smile could elevate, his silence could ruin. In this way, Louis turned personal charm into a political instrument. These early habits shaped the monarch who would later dominate France for more than 70 years. His childhood traumas taught him to control. His teenage triumphs taught him to dazzle. And his young adulthood taught him that the body, as much as the throne, could rule a nation. Long before his most infamous scandals, Louis XIV had already become addicted to the performance of power. What he would later practice in secret, the games of seduction, the dangerous hunger for passion, was simply the extension of lessons learned in his youth. Louis XIV was no ordinary young king. He was a boy scarred by fear, a teenager raised on admiration, and a young man who discovered that desire itself could be a form of monarchy. That foundation would make his later reign both magnificent and deeply disturbing. Louise de La Vallière never expected to become the lover of the most powerful king in Europe. She was not born into a family of immense influence, nor was she a woman trained in manipulation. She entered court as a lady in waiting, modest and soft-spoken, her charm lying not in boldness but in innocence. For a man like Louis XIV, surrounded by ambition and vanity, her purity was irresistible. At first, their connection was almost accidental. Louis was in his early 20s, already carrying himself like a god among men. He had flirted with women before, but his interactions were fleeting, often strategic. Louise was different. She was gentle, almost shy, and her devotion seemed genuine. Where others tried to impress him with wit or beauty, she offered something rare: sincerity. The king found comfort in her company, a refuge from the relentless games of politics and power. Their relationship soon became public, though discreet by the standards of Versailles. Courtiers knew when the king lingered in her presence, and whispers spread quickly. Louise, terrified of scandal, often tried to distance herself. She wept frequently, torn between her religious conscience and her feelings for the king. But Louis pursued her relentlessly. His authority made refusal impossible, and his charm made resistance unbearable. In time, she bore him children, illegitimate, yet legitimized later by royal decree. Each birth tied her more tightly to him, even as she longed for release from the role she had never sought. For Louise represented youth and tenderness. For Louise was both a lover and a burden she could not escape. The court, however, did not forgive her innocence. Other women envied her closeness to the king, families resented her influence, and rivals waited for her downfall. Though Louis protected her for a time, Louise was too fragile for the brutal politics of Versailles. She was ridiculed, isolated, and slowly broken by the pressure of being the king's mistress. Her tears became as legendary as her beauty. What made her story so tragic was that she seemed to love him sincerely. Unlike others who sought power through his passion, Louise cared less for titles or wealth. She gave him her heart in a world where hearts were currency, and for that she suffered most. Even Louis, in rare moments, acknowledged her devotion, yet his appetite was endless, and soon his eyes began to wander. Louise's decline was quiet. She was replaced, first gradually and then completely, by the bolder, sharper, and more ambitious Madame de Montespan. Unlike Louise, Montespan knew how to use seduction as a weapon, and she wielded it without mercy. For Louise, it was the final humiliation. She had given everything, only to be abandoned when her innocence no longer satisfied the king. In despair, she turned toward faith. She begged Louis to release her, and eventually, she entered a convent, retreating from the world that had consumed her. There she lived the rest of her life in prayer and repentance, carrying the memory of a love that had both elevated and destroyed her. Her story became a symbol of the dangers faced by women who entered the orbit of the Sun King. No matter how pure the beginning, the end was often heartbreak. For Louise de La Vallière was just the beginning. She opened the door to a life where mistresses would shape politics, where seduction would become a form of governance, and where desire would dictate the fate of an empire. She was the first in a long line, remembered not for her power, but for her suffering, a reminder that even kings can break what they claim to cherish. Maria Theresa of Spain entered France as a bride full of hope. Her marriage to Louis XIV was meant to secure peace between two powerful kingdoms. For her family, it was a political triumph. For her, it was supposed to be the beginning of a life beside a husband chosen by God. She was young, devout, and obedient, the very picture of a Catholic queen. Yet from the first years of her marriage, she discovered that her crown came with no guarantee of respect. Louis treated her kindly in public, fulfilling the duty of a husband and monarch, but privately his heart was elsewhere. Maria Theresa was shy, poorly educated compared to the witty women at Versailles, and she spoke French with difficulty. While she sat quietly at official gatherings, her husband filled his evenings with women who laughed, argued, and dazzled him with brilliance. The queen's simplicity, once considered a virtue, quickly became her greatest flaw in the eyes of the court. Her humiliation was constant. Everyone at Versailles knew that the king's mistresses held more influence than she did. Louise de La Vallière walked past her with tears in her eyes, but she still held the king's affection. Later, Madame de Montespan flaunted her triumphs openly, challenging the queen's dignity at every turn. Maria Theresa endured it silently, never raising her voice, never daring to confront Louis. She turned instead to her faith, spending long hours in prayer, trying to accept what seemed impossible to change. What made her suffering even more unbearable was the cruelty of the court itself. Nobles whispered about her in corridors, mocking her Spanish accent, her lack of sophistication, and her inability to keep the king's attention. She was the legal queen of France, yet treated like a background figure in her own palace. Her ladies in waiting often served as spies, carrying gossip back and forth, reminding her of her husband's latest passion. Each day was a reminder that her marriage, sacred in her eyes, was nothing more than a political contract to him. Even her children did not secure her position. Many of her pregnancies ended in tragedy, with infants dying before they could live long enough to matter. Only one son survived into adulthood, and he too would die before his father. In contrast, the king's illegitimate children with his mistresses flourished, granted titles and privileges. Maria Theresa, the queen, was forced to watch as the offspring of rivals received more recognition than her own children. The humiliation was unbearable, but she swallowed it, bound by duty and religion. Her faith became her shield. She confessed frequently, clung to her rosary, and relied on her chaplains for strength. But her piety, which might have inspired respect in another setting, only deepened her isolation at Versailles. While others competed for attention with beauty, wit, and intrigue, Maria Theresa remained withdrawn, a figure of sadness. To some courtiers, she seemed almost invisible. To others, she was a living symbol of defeat, a queen who could not compete with her husband's appetites. Louis never abandoned her completely. He still respected her as queen, but his affection was shallow, more duty than love. On rare occasions, when she tried to share her sorrow, he dismissed it with coldness. She was expected to endure nothing more, and she did endure, year after year, her dignity eroded by the knowledge that her crown carried no real power. In the end, Maria Theresa's life at Versailles was a portrait of humiliation. She fulfilled her role with patience, but she never won her husband's heart, nor the admiration of his court. She died in 1683, weary and broken, her passing hardly more than a footnote in the glittering life of Louis XIV. The king, upon hearing the news, reportedly showed little visible grief. Her death closed one chapter, but left a lasting image, the queen who bore the weight of betrayal in silence. Her story stands as a contrast to the flamboyant mistresses who dominated the stage of Versailles. While they thrived on seduction and ambition, Maria Theresa suffered quietly, forgotten in the shadows. Her humiliation was not only personal, it was public, a reminder that even a queen could be powerless in the court of the king of seduction. When Madame de Montespan entered Louis XIV's life, Versailles changed overnight. She was everything his queen was not: witty, fearless, ambitious, and unashamed of her desires. She did not lower her eyes in his presence. She met his gaze and held it. Where others tried to please him, Montespan dared to challenge him. That defiance ignited something in Louis, and soon the most powerful man in Europe was bending to the will of a mistress. Unlike Louise de La Vallière, Montespan never wept in the shadows. She paraded her triumphs in front of the court. Her beauty, her sharp tongue, and her ability to entertain the king made her untouchable. She was not just his lover, she became his partner in public life. Ministers feared her influence. Nobles begged for her attention. She placed her allies in positions of power and destroyed those who opposed her. For more than a decade, she was not merely a mistress, she was the center of the French monarchy. Montespan gave Louis many children, and he legitimized them, granting them titles and wealth. This act alone shocked Europe. The queen's children lived in the shadow of bastards, and yet Montespan celebrated it openly. The court understood the message clearly. Her hold on the king was absolute. She was bold enough to behave like royalty without a crown, and no one dared to stop her. Her wit was her greatest weapon. She mocked her rivals, entertained the king with clever remarks, and never allowed herself to appear dull. While Maria Theresa prayed in silence, Montespan laughed loudly at banquets, dancing, singing, and surrounding herself with admirers. Her presence was intoxicating. For Louis, she was the perfect companion, a woman who could match his energy, feed his ego, and flatter his ambitions. But what truly set her apart was her hunger for control. She understood that the king's passion was the strongest currency in France. She guarded it fiercely, attacking any woman who dared to compete. Louise de La Vallière faded into a convent under her shadow, and countless others were humiliated by her tongue before they could threaten her position. Montespan built a court within the court, a kingdom inside the palace, with herself at the throne. Her dominance came with risks. The higher she rose, the more enemies she made. Priests whispered about her arrogance, nobles resented her power, and rivals plotted against her. Yet Louis continued to defend her, blind to the resentment building around them. He adored her presence, even when her behavior scandalized Europe. It was said that she spent fortunes on jewels and gowns, flaunting her wealth with a boldness that shocked the pious. But Louis never complained. He paid every cost to keep her satisfied. Montespan's reign as mistress reshaped the monarchy. She proved that seduction could rival law, that influence in the bedroom could outweigh the authority of ministers. She became a symbol of Versailles itself, dazzling, decadent, and ruthless. For years, she was untouchable, and the queen herself lived in her shadow. Yet even at the height of her power, dark whispers followed her. It was rumored that her grip on Louis went beyond beauty or wit. The court gossiped about powders, potions, and charms. People whispered of secret visits to fortune, tellers and sorcerers who promised her eternal passion from the king. No one dared say it openly, but many believed that her reign was built not only on desire, but also on something far more sinister. Montespan had risen higher than any mistress in French history. She was celebrated, feared, envied, and hated all at once. In every way that mattered, she was the real queen of France. But power won through seduction comes with a cost, and the cost for Montespan was about to reveal itself in the most shocking scandal of Louis XIV's reign. The glittering facade of Versailles could not hide the rot beneath. By the late 1670s, whispers of poison and sorcery shook Paris and spread through the corridors of the palace. What began as isolated arrests of fortune, tellers and potion sellers spiraled into the most scandalous criminal investigation of Louis XIV's reign, the affair of the poisons. Dozens of aristocrats, priests, soldiers, and women of high society were accused of buying poisons to murder rivals or husbands. But the scandal went deeper. Testimonies revealed networks of black masses, ceremonies where infants were allegedly sacrificed, and where noble women begged priests, turned sorcerers for charms to secure love or wealth. The names that surfaced sent shockwaves across France. Among them, none caused greater uproar than that of Madame de Montespan, the king's most powerful mistress. The accusations were staggering. Witnesses claimed that Montespan sought the services of Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, a notorious fortune teller and poisoner. According to testimonies, Montespan commissioned aphrodisiacs to keep the king's desire alive and participated in rituals where prayers were replaced with blasphemy. In one shocking account, a priest performed a black mass over her body while she begged for Louis's eternal passion. Whether these claims were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. Just the rumor was enough to taint the royal bedchamber with the stench of sorcery. Louis was caught in an impossible position. To pursue the investigation fully meant risking the exposure of his mistress at the center of a satanic scandal. To ignore it would make him appear complicit. His solution was as cunning as it was desperate. He allowed arrests and trials to continue but ordered that certain testimonies be silenced, destroyed, or locked away in secret archives. Montespan was never formally charged, but the evidence pointing to her involvement was too widespread to dismiss entirely. The court seethed with gossip. Nobles whispered that the king himself was under a spell, that Montespan's power over him was unnatural, maintained not by beauty or wit, but by dark magic. Priests condemned the decadence of Versailles, suggesting that God's punishment would soon fall on France. Enemies of Montespan rejoiced at her disgrace, while her allies scrambled to protect her. For Louis, the scandal was devastating. His image as the Sun King, the embodiment of divine order, was shaken by rumors that his own passion had been manipulated by occult forces. Even if he refused to believe it, the shadow of the poison affair clung to his reputation. Montespan's influence began to wane, not because Louis no longer desired her, but because she had become a liability. The affair of the poisons ended with executions. La Voisin was burned at the stake, and dozens of others met similar fates. Yet many believed the king stopped the investigation before it could climb too high up the ladder. Entire sections of testimony were sealed away, hidden for centuries. What exactly was suppressed remains uncertain, but the silence speaks louder than the records. Montespan herself survived, shielded by the king's protection, but her reign as the real Queen of France was effectively over. She withdrew into the shadows, her name forever linked with poison and sorcery. Louis turned gradually toward a new companion, Madame de Maintenon, who offered him religion and stability instead of scandal. The affair of the poisons revealed a truth about Louis XIV's world that no golden mirror could conceal. Behind the elegance of Versailles lay desperation. Nobles poisoned rivals for inheritance, wives poisoned husbands for freedom, and mistresses sought magic to maintain their hold on the king. The most powerful man in Europe was not immune. His passion had become a battlefield where lust, ambition, and superstition collided, and it left a permanent stain on his reign. The Sun King ruled France with unmatched authority, but in this chapter of his life, it was clear that even he could be trapped by desire and by the dark forces that claimed to control it. Versailles was more than a palace. It was a stage where power and pleasure performed the same dance. Behind the polished mirrors and endless corridors, seduction had become a form of politics. Every noble understood the unspoken rule: to survive in Louis XIV's world, one had to be seen, admired, and, if possible, desired by the king himself. Fathers presented daughters not as children but as offerings. Husbands turned blind eyes while wives competed for the king's attention. For many families, a single night of favor could elevate them higher than years of service at court. Ambition was dressed in perfume and lace, and virtue was the price willingly paid for influence. The king's gaze was a currency more valuable than land or money. The women of Versailles trained themselves like soldiers of seduction. They mastered conversation, wit, and flattery. They knew when to laugh at his jokes, when to show modesty, and when to dazzle with boldness. Every detail mattered: the cut of a gown, the sparkle of a jewel, the way a fan was opened or closed in his presence. A misplaced word could end a family's fortune, while a smile at the right moment could create one. Louis thrived in this atmosphere. He was not merely a passive target of admiration. He encouraged it. He understood the spectacle, the thrill of being desired by everyone around him. The court became a theater, and he was both the star and the director. By rewarding some and ignoring others, he kept the competition alive. It fed his ego and reinforced his control. But the game was dangerous. Rivalries turned bitter. Women poisoned one another with gossip as vicious as any blade. Alliances formed and collapsed overnight, depending on who had captured the king's attention. Behind the laughter and music, jealousy burned like fire. To fall out of favor meant humiliation, exile, and ruin. To rise too high meant becoming the target of everyone else's hatred. The decadence of Versailles was no secret. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with shock at how openly the French court revolved around the king's pleasures. Religious leaders condemned the excess, calling it immoral and corrupt. Yet for the courtiers themselves, there was no alternative. The palace was a gilded prison where survival depended on playing the game of lust. Even those who never reached Louis's bed were caught in its orbit. Every appointment, every gift, every opportunity was touched by his personal passions. Ministers knew that a whisper from a mistress could undo months of political work. Generals understood that military glory meant less if the king's lover favored another man's company. Versailles was a palace of mirrors because nothing was real, only reflections of desire bouncing endlessly across its walls. The most unsettling truth was how normalized it became. No one at court truly believed that morality mattered. Success depended on how far one was willing to go, and everyone went as far as they dared. Women risked their reputations, men risked their honor, and families risked their names, all for the fleeting hope of a glance, a smile, or a night with the king. Louis XIV enjoyed every moment of it. His appetite was not simply personal, it was political. By keeping the court addicted to his desire, he ensured that no one could unite against him. Nobles fought each other for access, leaving him unchallenged. He had turned lust into governance, seduction into a weapon, and Versailles into the most dazzling prison Europe had ever seen. This was the paradox of his reign. The Sun King ruled with light, but his palace thrived on shadows. Versailles was a monument to glory, but inside it was a market of bodies and ambitions. Where the line between power and lust no longer existed, Louis XIV's passions were not private affairs, they were political earthquakes. Every time he favored one woman over another, the entire court felt the shock. Ministers lost influence, generals saw their campaigns dismissed, and noble families either soared or collapsed depending on who shared the king's bed. Desire was no longer a matter of the heart. It was a weapon that redrew the map of power in France. The rivalry between mistresses was brutal. Louise de La Valliere's tears became a warning, and Madame de Montespan's arrogance turned into a curse. Each mistress knew she was replaceable, and each fought to remain indispensable. They mocked one another, spread rumors, and in some cases even resorted to poison. What began as flirtation escalated into warfare, with reputations as casualties. The court of Versailles became a battlefield, not of swords and muskets, but of gossip, betrayal, and seduction. Families paid the price as well. Fathers who pushed their daughters toward the king often found themselves humiliated when his interest faded. Husbands who tolerated their wives' affairs with the monarch discovered they had surrendered honor for nothing. Children born from royal mistresses were legitimized, while legitimate heirs often died in obscurity. The lines between family loyalty and survival blurred until they were unrecognizable. Even the queen's dignity was destroyed by this system. Maria Theresa endured humiliation daily, but her suffering symbolized something larger. The crown itself was weakened. A king who placed mistresses above ministers created uncertainty in governance. Who truly ruled France, the monarch or the woman he loved that week? This question haunted foreign ambassadors, who realized that decisions in Paris were influenced as much by passion as by strategy. The costs were not only political. The poison trials revealed how far people were willing to go to secure the king's favor or to destroy rivals who threatened it. Wives poisoned husbands, nobles poisoned enemies, and servants became tools in deadly games. The pursuit of Louis's attention turned into an obsession so dangerous that it left corpses in its wake. Versailles was not just a palace of pleasure, it was a palace of calculated destruction. Jealousy consumed those closest to him. Montespan, once untouchable, fell from grace not only because of scandal, but because she could not bear to see the king's interest drift elsewhere. Her downfall was a slow humiliation, a reminder that no one could hold his desire forever. Her enemies rejoiced, proving that in Versailles, survival was not about loyalty but about timing. Louis himself paid a price, though he would never admit it. His constant indulgence weakened his credibility as a ruler chosen by God. Priests condemned him, ordinary people mocked him, and pamphlets spread across Europe portraying him not as the Sun King but as a slave to lust. His authority remained intact, but his moral image was shattered. Behind the glory of military victories and architectural wonders, the king was increasingly seen as a man ruled by his appetites. The cost of desire was measured in broken lives and ruined reputations. Women who once basked in royal favor ended up in convents, disgraced and forgotten. Families that had gambled everything on their daughters' beauty were left in poverty when the king's interest faded. Nobles who tied their careers to mistresses fell as quickly as they rose. Even Louis's own children bore the burden of his excesses, carrying names stained by scandal and whispers. In the end, Versailles revealed a bitter truth: the closer one came to the king's heart, the closer one came to destruction. Louis XIV ruled with absolute authority, but his desires created chaos that even he could not fully control. The palace he built to display his glory became a monument to the dangerous price of seduction, where ambition and lust devoured everything in their path. By the time Louis XIV reached his later years, the mask of the Sun King began to crack. The once tireless monarch who danced in ballets and chased mistresses with endless appetite was now weary, his body heavy with age and illness. What remained sharp, however, was his memory, and with it came guilt. For decades he had ruled through seduction, using desire as freely as armies. Now, he could not escape the shadows of those choices. The death of Queen Maria Theresa in 1683 forced him to confront his conscience. For years, she had lived humiliated, ignored while mistresses paraded their victories. At her funeral, Louis surprised the court by showing a rare moment of grief. Some believed it was genuine, others thought it was guilt. Either way, her absence left a silence he could not ignore. Into that silence stepped Madame de Montespan, a woman utterly unlike his former lovers. She was not young, nor dazzling, nor bold in the way Montespan had been. She was pious, disciplined, and wise. She began as the governess of his illegitimate children, but her calm presence soon drew Louis in. Where others had offered passion, Maintenon offered peace. She spoke to him of duty, of faith, of preparing for eternity. For a king approaching 60, these words carried more weight than perfumes or jewels. Under her influence, Louis changed. He distanced himself from open scandal, ended the public parade of mistresses, and spent more time in prayer. He and Maintenon were never officially married, but their relationship was an open secret, built not on lust but on companionship and religion. She became his conscience, constantly reminding him that kings, too, would face judgment. For the first time in his life, Louis seemed willing to listen. This transformation shocked the court. The palace that had thrived on lust now revolved around prayer. Nobles who had once schemed through seduction suddenly found the king unmoved by such tactics. Banquets became more restrained, entertainments less wild. Versailles was still magnificent, but beneath the gold there was a new-toned sobriety. For many courtiers it was a relief. For others it was suffocating. Louis himself struggled with the memories of his past. He could not erase the scandals, nor the women he had discarded. He often reflected on the children born of his affairs, legitimized by his hand but forever branded by gossip. He knew his pursuit of desire had hurt his family, weakened his moral authority, and fed the rumors that haunted his reign. In private, he confessed to priests, hoping to balance decades of indulgence with repentance in his final years. Yet even as he sought forgiveness, he never fully abandoned his pride. He remained the Sun King to the end, convinced of his divine right, convinced that history would remember his glory above his sins. Maintenon urged humility, but Louis believed that his grandeur was part of God's plan. Still, his shift from seducer to penitent marked one of the most striking contradictions of his life. The king who had once embodied lust now demanded chastity at court. The man who had humiliated his queen now lived under the moral guidance of a woman who acted more like a wife than a mistress. His conscience was awakened, but it was selective, repenting without ever surrendering power. In these later years, Louis XIV revealed a truth about absolute rulers. Even they cannot escape the weight of their own past. His body weakened, his pleasures dulled, and his mind turned inward. He sought salvation, but his legacy was already written. In whispers of mistresses, in scandals of poison, in the humiliation of a queen, and in the image of Versailles as both a palace of light and a palace of lust. Louis XIV left behind more than palaces, wars, and victories. He left behind a legacy poisoned by scandal. His reign was one of unmatched grandeur. Yet the whispers of his bedchamber never stopped echoing. The scandals of his private life became inseparable from the image of the monarchy itself, shaping how France was seen both at home and abroad. His illegitimate children were the most visible reminder of this dual legacy. He fathered many with Madame de Montespan, and he legitimized them publicly, granting them titles and positions usually reserved for the noblest bloodlines. By doing so, he blurred the sacred line between royal legitimacy and private indulgence. Ministers were forced to treat these children as political figures, and marriages were arranged with powerful families to secure alliances. For the court, it was both shocking and humiliating to watch bastards elevated above long-standing noble dynasties. Foreign courts looked on with fascination and contempt. Ambassadors reported that France, for all its military might, was ruled not only by the Sun King but by his mistresses and their offspring. Spain, Austria, and England mocked the French monarchy as decadent and corrupt. To Louis's enemies, every scandal was propaganda, proof that divine right had been replaced by divine lust. His reputation as a seducer spread beyond borders, undermining the sacred aura he tried so hard to build. The clergy also judged him harshly. Priests condemned the immorality of Versailles, calling it a den of sin. Sermons across France compared the king to biblical figures destroyed by lust, warning that his excesses invited God's punishment. The Catholic Church depended on the monarchy, but even within its walls, doubts grew about whether Louis was truly God's chosen ruler or merely a slave to his own desires. For the nobility, the legacy of scandal was personal. Families who had risen through the favor of mistresses were marked forever as products of corruption. Others who had lost daughters or wives to the king's appetites carried resentments for generations. The court system itself had been reshaped. Ambition was no longer measured only in military service or political skill, but in beauty, wit, and the ability to please the king. Versailles had turned into a lesson that in Louis's France, seduction was as powerful as a sword. Even after he tried to reform himself in old age, the shadow of scandal lingered. Madame de Montespan may have brought prayer to the palace, but the world did not forget Montespan's reign, the rumors of black masses, or the queen's lifelong humiliation. The poison affair was sealed away in archives, but its memory survived in whispers and pamphlets, fueling the idea that the Sun King's throne was tainted. The greatest cost of his desires was not only to his personal reputation, but to the monarchy itself. When the next generations of Bourbons inherited the throne, they also inherited the stain of his excesses. Versailles remained a symbol of luxury, but luxury was now inseparable from decadence. The people of France, burdened with taxes and hardship, began to view the monarchy as a playground for lust and ambition rather than a divine institution. This image would grow over decades, feeding the anger that would eventually erupt in revolution. Louis XIV wanted to be remembered as the king who embodied glory, power, and divine order, and in many ways he succeeded. He built Versailles, expanded France's borders, and ruled longer than any monarch in European history. But the scandals never disappeared. His mistresses, his illegitimate children, and the poisonous rumors of sorcery ensured that his reign was also remembered as one where power and desire were fatally intertwined. The legacy of scandal was simple yet devastating. Louis XIV proved that a king could command armies and conquer nations, but he could not conquer his own desires. And for all his grandeur, the world would never forget that truth. Centuries after his death, Louis XIV remains one of the most studied monarchs in history. His wars, his architecture, his political centralization, all have been analyzed in detail. Yet when historians speak of him, they often return to the same question: what role did his private life truly play in his reign? Was he a prisoner of lust, or was seduction another tool he used to dominate France? Some scholars argue that Louis was a man consumed by appetite. They point to the endless list of mistresses, the legitimization of his illegitimate children, and the humiliation of his queen as proof that his desires controlled him more than he controlled them. In this view, his reign's scandals were not calculated but compulsive. He was a man who could conquer Europe, yet could not conquer himself. His personal weaknesses spilled into politics, creating chaos that weakened the monarchy's moral authority. Others, however, see a different pattern. They suggest Louis knew exactly what he was doing. His mistresses, they argue, were not just lovers but instruments of power. By elevating them, he reshaped court politics around his personal desires, ensuring that every noble family remained dependent on him. By turning Versailles into a theater of seduction, he kept rivals occupied with jealousy and ambition rather than rebellion. To these historians, Louis's excesses were not failures, they were strategies. Lust became governance, and desire became control. The debate extends even to the affair of the poisons. Some claim it exposed his vulnerability, proving that he was easily manipulated by women and sorcerers who promised eternal passion. Others believe the way he silenced the scandal shows calculation, not weakness. He protected the crown's image, suppressed evidence, and sacrificed reputations to maintain stability. What looked like indulgence may have been cold political survival. Religious historians judge him harshly. They argue that his immoral behavior contradicted his claim to divine right and set a dangerous example for the nation. His reign, they say, sowed the seeds of the moral disillusionment that would later explode in revolution. Political historians, by contrast, emphasize his success in maintaining control for 70 years. They see his mistresses as part of a system that bound the nobility to him, ensuring their dependence and preventing rebellion. There are also those who highlight the contradictions. Louis's conscience in old age, shaped by Madame de Montespan, suggests that even he recognized the damage caused by his earlier life. His late turn to piety reveals a man haunted by guilt, perhaps admitting that his indulgence was not strategy but sin. Yet even then, he never disowned the system he created. He remained the Sun King to the end, proud and absolute. Modern historians often blend these views, acknowledging both the compulsive and the calculated. They see him as a man who indulged freely, but also exploited those indulgences for political gain. His sexual life was not separate from his kingship, it was woven into it. Versailles itself became the evidence. Its glittering halls housed not just political rituals, but the constant theater of seduction that defined his reign. What remains undeniable is the impact. Whether Louis XIV was a victim of his desires or a master of them, the consequences shaped France. Mistresses became political actors, illegitimate children became dynastic players, and scandal became part of governance. Historians may disagree on whether this was weakness or strategy, but they agree on one truth. No other European monarch fused lust and power so completely. The debate continues because Louis himself never resolved it. He confessed guilt in private yet maintained grandeur in public. He sought forgiveness yet never dismantled the system he built. He was both man and monarch, sinner and strategist, prisoner and ruler. And perhaps that duality is why his story still fascinates. His reign forces us to ask whether absolute power corrupts desire, or whether desire is the very essence of power. Louis XIV built Versailles to project order, discipline, and divine power. Yet the palace became a monument to contradictions. Behind the gold and mirrors lived ambition, jealousy, and lust. For all his victories on the battlefield and all his triumphs in politics, the stories people remembered most were the ones whispered in secret: the mistresses, the scandals, the poisons, the humiliations. Versailles was his greatest creation, but it was also the stage on which his darkest weaknesses played out for the world to see. The cost of his desires did not end with him. The system he created, where seduction replaced loyalty and scandal replaced virtue, outlived his reign. Nobles had learned to see the king's body as the source of power, not his crown. Families who rose through mistresses became dynasties. Children born in scandal became permanent actors in politics. The monarchy itself absorbed his reputation for excess, a reputation that grew heavier with each passing generation. When the revolution came a century later, pamphlets and speeches remembered not only taxes and famine, but the decadence of kings who wasted fortunes on lust while the people starved. Louis XIV had long been dead, but his image, proud, indulgent, and corrupted by desire, haunted the monarchy that carried his name. Versailles, once the symbol of France's strength, became the symbol of its decadence. His admirers argue that he was the greatest monarch Europe had ever seen. 70 years on the throne, victories across the continent, and a cultural legacy unmatched. His critics remind us that greatness built on scandal cannot last. They point to Maria Theresa's silent suffering, to Montespan's disgrace, to the poisoned victims of the court, and to the endless parade of women who were used and discarded in the pursuit of his appetite. Both views are true. Louis was magnificent, and he was disturbing. He was the Sun King, and he was the king of seduction. The shadow of Versailles lingers because it asks an uncomfortable question: what happens when desire and power are fused into the same man? Louis proved that such a fusion can build empires, but it also poisons them. His brilliance dazzled Europe, but his indulgence corroded the very foundation of monarchy. The echo of that contradiction can still be felt today whenever Versailles is remembered, not only as a palace of glory, but as a palace of lust. In the end, Louis XIV died as he had lived, surrounded by grandeur, yet followed by whispers. He confessed his sins, sought forgiveness, and left behind an empire scarred by both glory and scandal. History remembers him not just for the wars he fought or the buildings he raised, but for the women who shaped his reign and the scandals that shook his throne. His power was absolute, yet even absolute power could not shield him from the consequences of desire. And so the story closes where it began, with whispers. Whispers that spread through the corridors of Versailles, whispers that carried into the streets of Paris, whispers that survived centuries. They remind us that Louis XIV's reign was not just about kingship, it was about seduction, and the dangerous price of giving lust the throne of a nation. Was he a prisoner of his desires, or a master who used them to rule? Historians will argue forever, but one truth is undeniable. The Sun King's light cast shadows that no amount of gold could hide. Versailles remains, standing in brilliance, but beneath its mirrors lies the memory of a king whose passions shaped an empire and destroyed its innocence.